number of people. That is what a constitution must be. And having set the objective of the constitution, you then frame a constitution to achieve that objective.
Because we really do have a race problem. Those divisions are real. We see it in our politics, we see it in our trade union. We see that they take the divisions with them. Look at where people live in this US. You have enclaves in the Bronx and in Richmond Hill and in Brooklyn. They're taking the division with them.
Women are dying in the streets, and we have a government pontificating running around campaigning for women's vote. No women should vote in this election coming up unless there is something done to the legislation, as Magistrate Kim is advocating.
That voices like ours that are not in the political trench fighting it out, voices like ours should become stronger. One of the things about the Caribbean is that we have never had one discourse. Bass will know the days of the New World and the Old World and the radical left and so on. What we had was this concourse of ideas, which I think in the early days of independence pushed us in a certain direction. We've got to move back to that point of having these multiple discourses.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening to our viewers and to our two special guests. Let me first say a big thank you to GlobeSpan and to Nohar Singh for making this program available to us all, and it's all done free of cost to everyone. So thank you, GlobeSpan team. Friends, our viewers, tonight we want to apply some brakes on the political spin, on the political speak. Tonight we want to address a much more serious paradigm that Guyana is a part of. Guyana is a newcomer in the world scene of oil and gas and an oil-rich economy. There is an unquantifiable but immense amount of wealth that lies in the reserves, both discovered and undiscovered. With that picture in mind, we know that this country has the potential to become the fastest growing economy in the world. However, there are lots of concerns by Guyanese as to the real wealth and what amount of the real wealth would accrue to this country. These concerns have at first been whispers that contributed partially to the outcome of the last elections as the questions of the suspect management of finances arose. But those whispers are now a crescendo. The tsunami of corruption and shady deals that have surrounded the more recent oil deals are mind-boggling. We are seeing that contracts entered into affords us nothing. The recent Tolo discovery awakened Guyanese to the fact that in reality, there is no royalty therein for Guyana. And a minister of government, no less, takes cover under, quote, being instructed to sign the contract, unquote, without saying who instructed him and what amount of his free will was bypassed in that process. And the Guyanese public are being hit from all sides. The American ambassador literally tells us to shut up and let the American interests dominate us. And the government of Guyana hides the local content policy from Guyanese. It is no wonder at the public outcry we hear that foreign companies will get all the tax concessions and benefits while local businesses must continue to be overtaxed to meet the expenses of the state and the personal expenses of ministers. In a message, the Trinidad and Tobago Prime Minister Prasad Bisesar reminded Guyanese that we were once King Sugar. Then they took the sugar from us when we were colonized and manufactured that sugar and then sell it back to us. And she begs, please do not let this happen to your oil and gas. And she further counseled us, you need the foreign investors, but remember your local content needs. But this Guyana government seems oblivious to the calls of the Guyanese public and to the advice of those who have been there and done that. We seem to be a nation that is proud to make every mistake the rest of the country has made. Yes, one of the good things that's happened is that we have a natural resource fund bill that was assented into law in 2019. One would note, and I would need some legal guidance on this later, but one would know that assenting of the law came after the government lost a confidence vote in Parliament. However, The bill allows a 22-member Public Accountability and Oversight Committee to oversee fund management. But it is interesting to note that the investment mandate of the committee can only be set by the finance minister, who is a political creature. And therefore, Guyanese are wondering how much independence will be there and if this minister or the future minister will be instructed to use the fund for political purposes. At the same time, in July 2019, the government admits through the voice of the Attorney General, and I quote, that there still needs to be the drafting of a master plan for the oil and gas sector. Now, there still is need for a review and upgrade of existing laws on the extractive industry sector. And mind you, first oil is months away. Without the legal and regulatory framework being enforced, what will happen to the first set of revenues can only be predicated upon how the government reacted when it received the first contract signing bonus, stealthily. With that being said, there are too many opportunities that will be missed by Guyanese if we allow the politicians to get away with this. And if, as Guyanese, we cannot all get together and be vigilant about our resources. This sovereign wealth is for all of Guyanese now and in the future, not for a bunch of narcissists or a bunch of politicians who will divide the country and see themselves as a class above the rest. This country is lacking in regulations and legislation for a sector that has already started to produce. And of course, what seems to be in real shortage is sheer honesty. On the other side, we have a political stalemate in Guyana. Opposition says government of Guyana has lost the confidence of the people. The APNU AFC says too bad. So we have a political stalemate. So with first oil imminent and the country in a political logjam, the Guyanese people can collectively lose everything because the investors are just going to carry on their business in a merry way. The immediate future and the medium and long-term future of this country is no idle matter to become a political football. With each passing day, we are delegating our children and grandchildren to a miserable future in poverty if we cannot get our act right. One of the things that we have to do in this process is to learn from other countries who have been around the curve, who have been there and done that. As Guyanese, this is one of the many things we can do. We can certainly learn from those who face these challenges and were probably beaten many times, but their experience provides the course for our future. Ladies and gentlemen, viewers all, tonight we have two distinguished gentlemen who have been through it all. It is my pleasure and honor. Let me first introduce a very distinguished personality, former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, a man who is seen and respected widely as an elder statesman, Mr. Mahadeo Panday. Now, not many people can qualify with the excellence that he has and the humble beginnings he has had. His qualifications span economics and law, with numerous interesting areas in between, like he has a degree from the London School of Dramatic Art and appeared in no less than The Winston Affair, a movie set in the World War II background where he played the role of a correspondent. But this distinguished gentleman, from laborer to labor representative, from grassroots to head of state, this distinguished gentleman has had a career punctuated by success, inspirational stories, and of course, accompanying all of this along the way were some political slaps and nudges. His hallmark, he entered into politics since 1966 when we gained independence. His hallmark has been his vividly expressed vision for the development of his country, coupled with his passion, and oftentimes, to his opponents' discomfort, his sharp but ample wit that laid many asunder. He was also instrumental in the writing off of millions of dollars in Guyanese debt. Sir, welcome to our GlobeSpan program. How are you and what are your initial thoughts on these exciting new potential for Guyana and the Caribbean?
Well, I would like to compare Guyana, what is likely to happen in Guyana with what happened in Trinidad. The government in power in Trinidad and Tobago has experienced about 3 or 4 oil booms in which the price of oil went up, and therefore the Prime Minister at one time actually said, money is no problem here. But there are several people in Trinidad and Tobago, even unto this day, who do not have an adequate supply of food, shelter, education. Because what happened is, the problem with both Guyana and Trinidad is the constitution. When the constitutions were formed, I have no doubt that they thought they were doing the right thing. But as time progresses, circumstances change. And want to have a parliament in which the government controls the legislature. There is bound to be an enormous amount of corruption, an enormous amount of cronyism, and an enormous amount of feeding the supporters, so to speak.
Correct.
And that has been our problem in Trinidad. So that after all this oil boom and so on, we still have failed to provide 1.3 million people with an adequate supply of food, clothes, and shelter. We have not.
And those are the dangers that you would want Guyana to avoid.
And the only way they're going to avoid it is if the executive is separated from the legislature.
Okay.
And in Trinidad and Tobago, that is the problem. You see, you have a democracy when the people control the government. But in Trinidad and Guyana, the government controls the people's representative. That is, they control the parliament.
Very true.
And they can pass laws and do what they want, refuse to answer questions, and so on and so forth. And the people can do nothing about it. And unless we change that, Guyana is going to go through the same thing that Trinidad went through.
So, sir, let's come back to that point. Let me introduce Mr. Kevin Ramnarine to our viewers. Mr. Kevin Ramnarine is a former Minister of Energy and Energy Affairs of Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Ramnarine's tenure saw a fourfold increase in foreign direct investment from 500 million to almost 2 billion United States dollars in 2014, and a deep water exploration under production sharing contracts. Under his tenure, he also saw the first energy-related IPO in Trinidad's history, which ended up being the largest in Trinidad's history. He is served in the role of an economist, but has special qualifications in petroleum engineering and is a member of the Society of Petroleum Engineers. He was also a recipient of an award from the Petroleum Economist magazine in 2014. Mr. Ramnarine, welcome to this GlobeSpan program. And I would like to ask you to share with us your initial thoughts on this paradigm shift for Guyana, but also to share with us what's the mood in Trinidad? I mean, how are people reacting there to this exciting news coming out of Guyana?
All right, thanks, Dr. Mahadeo and Mr. Panday. Good night. And I am told that we have thousands of people listening, I'm sure, in Guyana, Trinidad, in the United States, Canada, the UK, and so on. So good night to everybody. I have been commentating a lot on Guyana for the last 3 years. The first speech I gave was in January 2017 at the Pegasus Hotel on the invitation of the Guyana Oil and Gas Association. And I've given speeches after that, at different conferences and so on. What has happened in Guyana since May 2015 with the first discovery is, really unprecedented in the history of the CARICOM. When that discovery took place in May 2015, we knew that there were going to be a lot more discoveries because that is simply how it works. You've discovered a new area, so there are a lot more fields to be discovered. So now, I think there have been 13 discoveries since 2015,
yes.
And the inventory of reserves is 6 billion barrels of oil. To put that into some perspective, since 1908, Trinidad and Tobago has produced about 8.7 billion barrels of oil equivalent. What we call oil equivalent is taking into consideration natural gas production. So what you've discovered so far is almost equivalent to what Trinidad's produced for 110 years.
Wow.
So it begins to give us some, you begin to wrap your mind around these very large numbers. Some basic modeling of the revenues shows that I think most Guyanese know that in the early years of production, the revenue to the state isn't going to be that significant because the company will be recovering its capital expenditure. But by the middle of the next decade, around 2025, 2026, you're going to have a exponential increase in revenue, going up to, I calculated, somewhere between 6 to 7 billion US a year. Now, your current budget in Guyana is about 1.3 billion US a year.
Correct.
So I just give this context so people could begin to wrap their minds around what is happening. And then it goes back to what Mr. Panday is talking about, institutional capacity. And the parliament is part of the institutional capacity of the country.
Correct.
So to oversee the management of that revenue.
Right.
Because we've had, as Mr. Panday said, we've had a couple oil booms in Trinidad. And those oil booms have now become subject matter for all the academics at the university to write PhD theses on, right?
Right.
And the World Bank and the IMF could write papers and say what we did wrong and so on. So the three things I think that Guyana has to get right is, one, the institutional capacity, building the institutions to oversee this sector. Two would be infrastructure. Guyana has to have the infrastructure to support this industry. And we already see there's one shore base in the East Bank, the Gisby shore base.
Yes.
And the third thing, which is very important, and it's something that I'm sure Mr. Panday would, being a prime minister who put in place a lot of emphasis on education. So the first thing is institutional capacity, and institutional capacity is related to law,
Right.
and the enactment and passage of law to support those institutions. And
Right.
the second thing is infrastructure, and the third thing is skill development.
Good, got you. But let's come back to that just now. So what's the mood around the private citizens and the business sector in Trinidad?
Well, I mean, the average, if you look at comments on social media and so on, people in Trinidad are, by and large, they're very excited and happy for Guyana. Just today, we read a story that JetBlue is going to be flying.
Correct.
From New York to Georgetown. American Airlines has already started direct flights and so on. So it's beginning to, those things are signals that things are beginning to change in the Caribbean.
Right.
And so the mood in Trinidad around that is, and of course, it's no secret that Trinidadian businessmen are, of course, looking for opportunities in Guyana, naturally. Our economy is going through a period of stagnation here, and there's not much opportunities for businessmen to invest here right now. So many of them have come down to Guyana, and what the average Trinidadian is, curious, excited. As you would appreciate, there's a lot of linkages between Trinidad and Guyana.
There is.
In terms of people, there are people who are married.
But Mr. Ramnarine, let me interject there. Let's address an elephant in the room, though. There is indeed a lot of linkages, and historically speaking, so going back to the days pre-independence and so forth between Guyana and Trinidad. But as you know, Guyanese have always viewed themselves as a very hospitable nation. Very, except election time, we're very peaceful people. But the elephant in the room is many Guyanese have felt a lot of hurt by how they were treated going through your shores. I don't know, but I used to normally tell my friends in Trinidad, come take a Guyanese passport and visit Trinidad and see how you're treated going through immigration and airlines that would have surcharged and overcharged this leg of their thing and so forth. So I would want to assure the Trinidadian public that we're not gonna do the same. But to you both, why should Guyanese listen to Trinidadians?
Well, I mean, I'll answer and Mr. Panday could answer. Guyanese should listen to whoever is giving the best advice.
Thank
And
you.
it doesn't have to be Trinidad, and it doesn't have to be any specific country. There is a whole range of options available. There's, you can get advice from the Norwegians, from the British, from the Trinidadians, and you have to take the advice which best fits your needs.
Correct.
When I
to
first
what purpose? With the best advice to what purpose? That's the
yeah,
issue.
sure. And Mr. Panday is correct. The best advice that fits your current scenario
Correct.
and
Correct.
your aims and objectives for development. Because your country is not Norway in 1969. Norway in 1969, when Norway discovered oil in 1969, Norway was already a pretty advanced country.
Mm-hmm.
Norway was the second richest country in Scandinavia in 1969, behind Sweden. They had well-established universities, shipbuilding industry, a fishing industry, and so on. So to compare Norway in 1969 to Guyana in 2019 is not a fair comparison.
Understood.
So you have to understand what are your needs.
And Ms. Panday, you're so right. So you have to take the advice to suit the needs.
Okay, there are two sets of advice you need. You need, first of all, the technical advice about production and sale and that sort of thing like that. I am not concerned about that because I am sure that the Guyanese can put their hands on a sufficient number of technologically qualified people in order to get their oil out and sell it. My problem is, what's going to happen to the money from the oil? Will it redound to the happiness of the people?
Correct.
It did not in Trinidad and Tobago. And it cannot in a society that is divided on race with the constitutions that exist in both countries. That is the problem. We should focus on people because the technical people will do their job. I have no problem with that.
Well, you're right. You're right on that. And on that note, sir, I want to call on Devin, our technical guy, because you're so right. I mean, things could go really, really well for Guyana, but it could also go horribly wrong. And the truth is that many countries are there as experiences, as you pointed out, Mr. Ramnarine, that Nigeria, for example, has allowed corruption to kill all the potential. I think Botswana did so well, but Sierra Leone, they just allowed themselves to be swamped by everything about oil. So I'm gonna let our viewers and yourself take a look at the corruption and stuff that really brought Nigerian potential down. Dev, over to you.
Nigeria's economy has risen and fallen on the fortunes of oil. Along with gas, oil accounts for 35% of the country's economy and 75% of government revenues. No wonder then that the global collapse in oil prices had such a devastating impact on Nigeria's economy. Added to which, many of Nigeria's pipelines have been attacked by militant groups in the region, disrupting production. It's resulted in a currency crisis, with far less money going into the government coffers, and investors fleeing, pulling out badly needed capital. Double-digit inflation has made food, clothes, medicine and fuel prohibitively expensive for many Nigerians. Last June, the central bank devalued the naira. It fell more than 30% against the dollar. Despite that, the naira is still worth far less on Nigeria's dollar exchange black market. Last year, Nigeria fell into recession. Now it could be on the cusp of a recovery. Oil prices have made gains since OPEC promised to cut production, and the IMF thinks Nigeria will exit recession this year. President Buhari's budget plan has sweeping economic reforms, including asset sales, spending cuts, and tax hikes aimed at the rich. Plus, he plans to reduce Nigeria's unhealthy reliance on oil. It could be enough to clinch loans from the World Bank and African Development Bank, bringing Nigeria back to growth.
Great. Thank you. Very instructive. So let us come back to our discussion. Mr. Panday, if I can start with you, because you have raised the most important point in this entire discussion, and that is, how can the oil revenues be used for the betterment of the lot of the people of the country now and in the future? And you have said that Trinidad has also failed in that aspect of providing for the future betterment of its people, and even in the present time when you had the oil boom. But your thoughts more on what we can do to have that fund flow down to the lower economic rungs of the economic ladder.
The government will be the ones who are going to be in receipt of and in charge of the monies that are coming from the oil industry. In Trinidad and Tobago, there's an enormous amount of corruption, waste, and mismanagement. There is allegations of serious racial and ethnic divisions in the society. And what happens is the people do not benefit. Just imagine, we have had so many oil booms, and we have been unable to provide 1.3 million people with a regular supply of such a basic necessity as drinking water.
Wow.
We're surrounded by the sea and so on. But all of this, so what is the meaning of all this oil and prosperity that's going to come, whether in Trinidad or to Guyana, if it means nothing to the people? That is the important point. And I argue that it is only when the people genuinely control the government is that these benefits will redound to the welfare of the people. The object of the government has got to be to so organize the society that it conduces to the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people.
Correct.
That is what I am concerned about. So
Correct.
that the monies will come. Mm-hmm. It really is not important how much money you get. What is important is what you do with it.
To do with it, yes.
Does it redound to the happiness of the people? That is my concern, and has been in Trinidad and Tobago. And let me interject a little bit.
Yeah.
When I went to Guyana the other day, I was called upon to make a speech, and I said exactly what you said. I said, now that Guyana has oil, I hope they do not treat us Trinidadians in the same way that Trinidadians treated them when they came to Trinidad. I just want to remind them that while I was in office, I legalized all the illegal immigrants in Trinidad and Tobago, which included many Guyanese.
Thank you. But let's come back to your point, because you have made you have made that point, and I agree with you. But I don't think that people have a grasp to the magnitude of the change, the fundamental change that is required, not just in our normal day-to-day legislation, but to the very core of Guyana, the Constitution itself. Because presently our winner-take-all politics will just take everything. That's what you're saying.
Sure. The government can do what they want with the money.
Correct.
They can steal it. They can give it to their friends and family and so on and so forth, while the ordinary people suffer.
So if we marry that point with something Mr. Ramnarine said earlier, because one of the fears we have with this thing called Dutch disease is something that you have experienced, I think, in a negative way. The governments are quick to shift oil revenues from the resource fund to other sector to prop them up, thereby not making proper investment on its own for a long-term development. Now, one would say you're taking it to help the lot of the poor people. But then from an investment and economic perspective, those decisions have to be weighed very carefully. Mr. Ramnarine, what do you think?
Well,
Sorry.
Okay. Mr. Panday, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, no, you.
All right, okay. Dutch disease is something that we've been hearing a lot about in Guyana and Trinidad for the last, 20 years. It is a real thing. And how it works very simply is that the government of Guyana or Trinidad collects a tremendous amount of a windfall of revenue. And naturally, governments like to spend money. And those monies are more than likely spent on services, construction services, wage increases, and so on. And what you do, you create what they call aggregate demand shock in the economy. And your services sector begins to grow. And what you have is a migration of labor from manufacturing, mining, fishing, agriculture into the services sector. And you have now a shrinkage of agriculture, a shrinkage of mining, a shrinkage of all those industries that have made Guyana the most diversified economy, in my opinion, in the Caribbean. So that is something that you have to guard against. Because I was down in Berbice sometime last year, and I was talking to one of the big rice farmers down there. And he was telling me that he was beginning to get problems to get labor. And I said, well, I could tell you, if the Guyanese economy begins to gallop and to sprint, you're going to get more problems to get labor, because people will migrate from agriculture, labor will move from agriculture into the urban areas, into the services. And that is what happened in Trinidad between, let's say, 2003 and 2010, around there, when we had a second boom. So that is something you have to guard against. And one of the ways so what's the solution? The solution is to focus on the supply side of the economy and on the stabilization fund. So I would focus on spending the money on education, health, and your infrastructural deficit in Guyana, and saving some of the money, of course, in your heritage and stabilization fund. Mr. Panday, when he was Prime Minister, introduced the concept of the stabilization fund in 1999. It was the government that came after changed the name and so on. But that was introduced in 1999 by then Finance Minister Brian Kwaitong.
So, Mr. Panday, you want to pick it from there? Let's talk about the stabilization fund under your watch.
You see, it does not matter how big the stabilization fund becomes. If the people who are in charge of the stabilization fund are corrupt,
yes,
and the people have no control over them, then what is the point of the stabilization fund insofar as it relates to the happiness of the people? So we go back, no matter what we do, we have to go back to the constitution that puts power in the hands of the people over the government, and not the other way around.
But you see, the problem we have is constitutional reform will take time, and that too has to come from not just the will of the people alone, but the will of the politicians to want change. In Guyana, all the politicians want to change is to allow themselves to serve in the National Assembly while being dual citizens. But I'll tell you what, Guyana has had a couple of years of disease. It didn't reach to the Dutch stage as yet, because we destroyed sugar. We're slowly but surely destroying rice. And the fact is that we have done, successive governments of Guyana has done everything to chase people away from this country rather than to encourage people to come. And so, Mr. Panday, to your point, I don't know that as a Guyanese, I have confidence that my executive or my legislature, either of them, or collectively, sees anything beyond political power at any expense. And that's what landed you in problems and will certainly land us in problems. Because we are sacrificing the long-term goals for short-term political power and political patronage.
You're absolutely correct.
You see, the thing is that when we look across Guyana, I mean, there are lots of independent persons who are speaking up and speaking out, and that's one of the good advancements that was made. I mean, I know that a lot of government people criticize us who are the independent speakers. Pre-2015, we were as opposed to corruption as we are now. And the good thing that's happened, the greatest paradigm shift, I think even beyond oil, is the fact that Guyanese people have started to stand up and speak out. And I would like to ask your opinion, while it may not be legislative in nature, But isn't there need for a proactive, independent, non-political force that can stand up and speak out? And before you answer, we have Transparency International, which also has seemed to have lost its voice at this stage. But I think we need a proactive, independent, non-political force that can stand up and speak out, a cross-section of Guyanese.
No, I didn't get the drift of what you were saying.
Well, what I'm saying that in Guyana, if the will of the politicians are not there to make this change, constitutional and otherwise, should there not be the civil society demand where we can create a non-political force? Was there any such move in Trinidad?
Let me tell you something. History is replete with examples of a people wishing for change. And if they can get the change peacefully, all well and good. But a time comes when they feel that because of their powerlessness, they cannot get the change peacefully. They resort to violence. History is replete with examples of that.
Correct.
And I fear that may happen in Trinidad. As a matter of fact, crime in Trinidad has escalated to an unbelievable level. And when I spoke of a revolution, I am now beginning to think that crime is an expression of that revolution.
That's a very good point, indeed. Indeed. And our crime situation has been on an exponential increase, except that the security people don't see it, but the people who feel it knows it. Mr. Ramnarine, I want to come back to you with the three factors you mentioned. One was the capacity building in terms of law and order institution. The other was the infrastructure to support the industry and, of course, civil empowerment. There is an IMF publication dated 2018 that is titled The Dutch Disease Phenomenon and the Lessons for Guyana, the Trinidad and Tobago Experience. Now, this document specifically advises against the mistakes of Trinidad, and I think it's instructive what you guys are saying so far. However, it identifies transfers, the point we mentioned earlier, transfers and subsidies from the energy sector to other areas to prop them up. And the document went on to almost plea that there must be, if any, the shift made to what you were speaking about, Mr. Ramnarine, that is in education, in building an empowered political society that can take the country when the decline happens.
Well, the transfers and subsidies, part of it is in Trinidad had a lot to do with the subsidization of fuel. We probably spent about close to 40 billion Trinidad and Tobago dollars since 2001 subsidizing liquid fuel, diesel and gasoline and so on for the population. We also subsidize electricity in Trinidad. So we pay, the average household in Trinidad pays about 5 US cents per kilowatt hour. The average household in Guyana would pay about 25 cents per kilowatt hour. Electricity in Guyana is very expensive compared to Trinidad. And the reason for that is subsidization and cheap natural gas and so on. So a lot of what you see as transfers and subsidies in Trinidad is subsidization of fuel and electricity and subsidization of state enterprises like the Water Authority and other state companies and so on. So one of the Guyana currently, as far as I'm aware, it does not really subsidize fuel to the population.
Correct.
And perhaps you want to keep it that way. You're already accustomed to that. Perhaps you may want to keep it that way, you know?
Well, correction a little bit. There have been a history of some sort of subsidy in terms of, depending on the fluctuation of the oil price on the world market. The government takes some of the buffer off when it gets a little bit too wacky.
But it's nothing like what we have in Trinidad, of course. No. And the extreme is, of course, Venezuela, which is, a ridiculous amount of subsidy.
Correct.
To the point where they clearly, that has crippled their country and so on. So, in terms of, so you have to really keep an eye on your expenditure, because as you know, as countries begin to earn more money, there's a pattern where expenditure runs ahead of revenue.
Right.
And because oil is a cyclical industry, subject to the vagaries of the international markets and so on, you will go through boom and bust cycles.
So which really affected you guys a lot, right?
What you find is that your expenditure keeps going up in a linear fashion, and then you're subject to these fluctuations in oil and gas revenue, and you go through periods of depression, economic depression, and periods of economic exuberance and boom and so on.
Right.
So you really want to rein in the expenditure and and keep a check on government spending.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it comes back to the point Mr. Panday was making: the strength of the parliament to have oversight over the government, and the strength of your institutions in general.
Correct. But you see, at the end of the day, coming back to you, Mr. Panday, I mean, I hear you. I really, really hear you. And I think everybody who's online at this moment has focused on what both of you have said. But, Mr. Panday, you have mentioned something that is at the core, has been eating away at the core of Guyanese for years now. And that is this whole thing about corruption. I mean, the truth is Guyana's president, as you know, we have an executive president. Guyana's president is immune. You can't take criminal action against whoever is the president. But and those are some of the fundamental change that by and large Guyanese feel has to take place.
Exactly. I am sorry to be harping back on my original theme, which is you've got to change the constitution. Suppose the president commits robbery and crime and so on. He can't be arrested. What kind of constitution is that?
Correct.
Why is it equal to everybody? But sorry.
Yeah, go on, sir.
So the point I'm making is that the struggle of Ghana, before it gets its oil boom, is the same as Trinidad and Tobago. We have to change the constitution so that governments are under the control of the people and not the other way around.
Well, we have an interesting scenario here. There's been a court, the court basically of Guyana had, I mean, I'm not going to ask you to comment unless you want to, but the court in Guyana had ruled that the finance minister should be detained. Should be detained for failing to meet the court's demands in terms of repaying some funds to some business that took the finance ministry to court. Right?
A Trinidadian company.
Trinidadian company. But what was interesting is that immediately as that charge came from the court, the president gave a pardon.
Exactly my point. And the parliament can do nothing about it.
Parliament can do
That's
nothing.
the point. The people can do nothing about it. So where does power lie? Not in the hands of the people, in the few that control the government. And you have to have a constitution that prevents that few from exploiting the country for its own purpose and needs.
Correct. So, Mr. Ramnarine, if I can just segue off to another area, one of our viewers noted that is investment in renewable energy one of the things that Guyana should focus on, using the sovereign wealth fund?
Definitely. I think what Guyana should be aiming to do is to generate all its electricity, probably not all, but as much as possible, make use of your hydro potential. Mm-hmm. You have tremendous hydroelectric potential. That's very obvious. And make use of your solar potential. But you're always going to need to have your base load of power coming from some sort of fossil fuel source for the time being. But you could eventually evolve to 100% renewable. But I think that one of the biggest, if you were to ask every Guyanese businessman, what is the number one problem you have in terms of doing business in Guyana, he will tell you the cost of electricity and the reliability of electricity in Guyana. As you know, most of the major business houses in Guyana run off the grid. They run using their own generator, I mean, I was surprised to see that Movie Town and Giffland Mall have huge generators. In Trinidad, if you want to build a mall like that, you don't need to put that among the generators, right? So that obviously is going to increase the cost of doing business in Guyana. If you have a business where you have to do cold storage of fish, you have to have your own generators. I would think the hotels like Marriott and Pegasus and so on, they have their own generators, right?
Yeah.
And they run off the grid.
Correct.
So that has increased the cost of doing business in Guyana. So one of the things that the oil wealth should be focused on, as again, I spoke about infrastructure, electricity's infrastructure, is having a more reliable source of electricity and cheaper electricity. Hydro, there was a hydro project on the cards many years ago that sort of fizzled out. The Amalia Falls project. I don't know if that is still being looked at, but there's a lot of potential for hydro and solar around Guyana.
Well, the only thing that happened with the hydro project is it became politicized. So, once again, we have something that's because of politics goes nowhere. But let's look at another aspect. I mean, you both mentioned that civil empowerment, the training of people, the overall betterment of people. And Mr. Ramnarine, you just said that the uplift of infrastructure like electricity is important. Let us look at the training and the empowerment of people in terms of what specific areas should we focus on. The reason I'm asking you this, the new thinking, because oil is the new kid on the block, everybody wants to gravitate towards it, and I'm telling people, listen, there's still people who are going to be sick, there's still people who are going to need attorney services, there's still people who are going to need counseling and all of these things. And the reason I'm asking you this, with an increase in wealth in a nation, you will also have an increase of the social ills. We got to watch out for things like upsurge in drugs, upsurge in the way abuses, and upsurge in all kinds of social ills. And so what's both of your take in terms of empowerment from an education perspective, which you had mentioned earlier?
I just want to, I know there's a lot of expectation in Guyana around this oil industry, but I just wanted to mention that in Trinidad, the oil industry, the energy sector accounts for 4% of the labor force because it's a highly automated, highly capital intensive industry. So
that's a good point. Yeah.
So you're not going to get this huge amount of people in Guyana employed in this industry. So people are going to have to prepare themselves for other skills, which are, the skills of the future, the IT, learning to write code and so on, things like that. But within the oil and gas sector, there's going to be a need for, the engineers, the geologists, the commercial people, the petroleum lawyers, and so on. But it is not going to be the panacea for employment that people think it is.
Did Trinidad put any of its oil natural resource fund or your fund in towards the bolstering of your social? Here we have your social services fund, your social security fund.
As far as I'm aware, that came out of your general funding for the budget, right? And the monies in the Heritage and Civilization Fund were sterilized and put aside. Yeah.
But the reason I ask that is that Guyana has a situation where I haven't seen the most recent, or I don't know if they did a more recent actuarial study of what we call the national insurance scheme here. But I do know that if we keep on going the way we are going, that scheme is going to collapse sooner or later. And with a collapse of a scheme like that, all your pension and everything is going to go. The reason I ask this, and Mr. Panday, the reason I'm directing it to you is going back to your earlier point, government would have these knee-jerk reactions that, this part is failing, let's take a couple $1 million and throw it there, without thinking of the repercussions of doing so. Example, 7,000 sugar workers are home because the estate is closed. Nobody thought, well, that's going to have an impact on Social Security. Nobody thought that with the estate closed, it's going to have an impact on the drainage and irrigation of the country, or it's going to have an impact on security and maintenance of dams. So it's easy, and you as an experienced politician, as Prime Minister, how hard was it for you to put your foot down and say, no, we can't put money towards these things, or yes, we will go because it's people what they need? Do you just give in to the people's needs?
In Trinidad, the opposition has no say. It can talk. It has no power. For example, we do not have something equivalent to the Senate investigating committees of the United States, where politicians, government can be called upon to publicly answer questions and give account. So the government is not accountable. It's not accountable to the people at all. That is the problem.
And that's the same scenario in Guyana. I mean, the opposition can make all the noises at once, but can't move
exactly.
anything.
Exactly. So, how is this oil boom going to affect the people's lives?
Correct.
If the people have no control over it.
Correct. Well, the thing is, I don't have.
They're going to end up. They're going to end up exactly like Trinidad. Just imagine, we have 1.3 million people. We can't provide everybody, and we haven't been able to provide housing for all our people. We haven't been able to provide water. We haven't been able to provide electricity. We haven't been able to provide the basic necessities for all of our citizens.
Correct.
We must provide it for just some, which is what the money is being used. Sorry?
Let me pass on a question to both of you. So one of our viewers have said that, when reflecting back to your days in government, if at that time the foresight may not have been in you then, because in hindsight everything is perfect, but whether there was any attempt to have constitutional reform in Trinidad that would speak to the points you're raising.
That's a good point. First of all, in order to reform the Constitution, you have to work within the present Constitution. That is to say, you have got to get specified majorities, 3/4 majority and so on and so forth. When I was in office, we didn't have that. We didn't have the majority. There are only 3 governments that had that kind of majority in order to effect constitutional reform. The first was Dr. Eric Williams. The second was Prime Minister A.N.R. Robinson, and the third was Kamala Prasad Bisesa. But neither the government nor the opposition wants change from that racial voting that we have in Trinidad, which is ruining the country. None of them want change. So the only way change can come in Trinidad has got to be by some other means, certainly not peaceful.
Correct. Well, that is the exact paradigm. That's the exact paradigm in Guyana. There's a racial divide. Although there has been overtures by both parties, I've said publicly that maybe Guyana's future will change when the PPP can have an Afro-Guyanese as its presidential candidate, and the PNC can have an Indo-Guyanese as its presidential candidate. But let's, Mr. Ramnarine, one of our viewers have asked that you have been to Guyana for a number of years, and you would have shared your ideas and recommendations. In your estimation, has there been any listening to what your advice has been, and any change in the paradigms you were speaking to or the persons you were talking with?
Well, I think certainly there's been a shifting in the consciousness in Guyana. People are aware, and there's a lot of people, writing in the newspaper, and clearly when you read what people are writing, they're beginning to understand this sector, which is important. In terms of, I'm reading the question here now, how are we doing so far? I come back to the need for institutions.
You can be brutally frank, right?
Yeah, no, I'll be frank. There's a need. So, let's cut to the chase. There's a need for certain laws to be put into the statute books that will regulate and oversee the sector. and those laws have not been put into the statute books as yet. So we are, about 6 months away from first oil?
Correct.
And there is no regulatory framework in place to oversee the sector. That is something which I think has to be addressed. And as we are discussed off air, in the absence of that, the country is always going to be a few steps behind the multinationals. Right. And the multinationals will always be 3 or 4 steps ahead of the country. So you have a lot of catching up to do. The second thing which I think has to be addressed is the infrastructure that's needed to support the sector. And that infrastructure in itself creates jobs, right? Because that shore base in Houston, and when I tell people in Trinidad the shore base, Guyana's shore base is in Houston, they think it's Houston in the US. But there is a place called Houston in Guyana.
Correct.
That shore base in itself, I mean, if you go there, it has created hundreds of jobs. And I looked around the shore base, and it's mainly Guyanese I see working there. So you need more of those shore base type investments.
Absolutely.
And the third thing which is happening, but probably should be happening a lot faster and a lot at a larger scale, is the skills development.
Right.
I know many, and you and I know many Guyanese, because I think we are on the same WhatsApp chat group. Many Guyanese on their own initiative and their own funding and so on have gone abroad and are outfitting themselves with the skills. We know people, Guyanese people who are all over the UK studying petroleum economics and petroleum law and so on right now. But that needs to be happening in a much more structured and larger scale. One of the things that, we got some things right in Trinidad, we got some things wrong. We didn't get everything wrong. We got some things right. One of the things that we have in our production sharing contracts is the provision for scholarships. So every production sharing contract that the government signs has the provisions for a certain amount of scholarships, and hundreds of Trinidadians have been able to be educated all over the world at the level of PhDs and so on. Of course, they have to come back home.
Correct.
And serve for a period of time. But putting that into your production sharing contract is very important. The requirement for the companies to pay for scholarships.
Right. Very good point. But let's get on to something else in relating to oil. Mr. Panday, under your you might have had the experience of this maritime impact. I know we still, Mr. Ramnarine, I know we still have to pass these laws. And this, my point in raising this is to let our viewers know how badly lacking we are with the basic legislation in place. Maritime impact of the exploration and drilling and so forth is something that we haven't even started to have a national conversation about. It is certainly going to impact the fisheries industry. It's certainly going to impact the environment. It's certainly going to impact a number of things. How have you, what would have Trinidad done to temper the effect of anything like this?
Well, nothing that I'm aware of, but I'm sure that Kevin knows much more about this area than I do.
Well, I'll tell you a story. We have something called the National Oil Spill Contingency Plan in Trinidad, which is a plan which was finalized when I was minister. Before that, we had an earlier version of that plan, which was done in 1977. So we thought that, we needed a new plan. And we got all the agencies together, the Environmental Agency, the Coast Guard, and the Marine Affairs Division, and so on. And we got a new plan. And when I was signing the new plan into effect, I made a comment. I said, let's hope we never have to use this. Yeah. And within 3 months of me making that statement, there was a huge oil spill in December 2013. And then after that, we continued, and Mr. Panday would know that we continue to suffer on a regular basis oil spills in Trinidad of varying magnitudes. And the reason for that is our infrastructure offshore is aging. Yeah. And as it ages, you have greater probability for spillages.
Correct.
So you would have to manage that in Guyana.
But stick a pin, because that you have stepped right into my follow-up question on that point to you both. What measures did Trinidad put in place for inspection and all this stuff to guarantee good management of the oil rigs? Because risk management is to stop it from happening in the first place, right? And you know, the cost of correcting is always so much more. What would Trinidad have done in its inception or its early years to have inspection of the rigs for health and safety concerns and so forth?
Well, that's the remit of the Ministry of Energy in Trinidad. And we have, if I must say, we have a pretty good HSS, we call it the HSSE department, health, safety, security, environment.
Mm-hmm.
And they are responsible for the inspection of rigs, the inspection of platforms, the inspection of pipelines, and they have they have the power over the companies.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
And if they inspect your facility and it's not fit for purpose and it doesn't meet their standards, you have to bring it up to standards. So the problem in Trinidad is not so much the institutional capacity of that department. It is that we have aging infrastructure, that sometimes we have infrastructure sometimes 60, 70 years old. And as a result, you get these oil spills from time to time.
But you see, Mr. Ramnarine, one of the reasons I asked this question is given our earlier off-air conversation. Now, it's going to take Guyana 5, 7, 10 years, who knows how long, to get our legislative pieces, to get all the agencies, everything needed for day one of oil. It's going to take us another 5 years to get that done, providing the political will can be in place. Meanwhile, with none of these things in place, oil is going to be, coming on stream very, very soon. But we're in a real crisis situation then. One, the investors are going to reap their benefits and take it out. Those smart businessmen, like some of the smart Trinidadians and Guyanese, are going to come and reap all the benefits. And we will be chasing the 8 ball all the time. We'll be behind it all the time.
Yeah. And it comes back to what is the national interest? And the national interest has to be that you have to have these laws on the statute books, and these laws will give life to the institutions that will manage, govern, and regulate this sector. Good. So that is going to take some time to put together. And it's something, as you said, the country, therefore, is behind the multinationals.
Yeah, and that's one of the main concerns a lot of us have here. And then one of our comments coming in too is that we need to be cognizant of climate change. But before we comment on the climate change, to your professional qualifications with engineering and so forth, what's the risk Trinidad faced, and Mr. Prime Minister, under your watch, was there any for wastage, for management of waste, byproducts and waste from the fuel sector, and what you did with it?
Ramnarine is more equipped to answer than I am.
Well, I could tell you that I was in Guyana up to a few months ago, and I was speaking to one of the big service providers. I wouldn't want to call the name of the company, and they indicated to me that they have a waste management problem, in that they have certain waste that they have to dispose of, and they would have to ship it out of Guyana because there's no facility in Guyana to process it and so on. Mm-hmm. So waste management, from the point of view of solid waste, from the point of view of the liquid waste and so on, is something that, so it's a whole, there's so many things that you have to prepare for, and there are companies already in Guyana that are specializing in waste management to take the waste away from Exxon and so on. But it's actually a business opportunity.
Correct. You see, the reason why it's very important for Guyanese to pay attention to these areas is listen, Guyana is part of the lungs of the world. We have the Amazon rainforest. We have, the conservation place here. We have so many acres and acres of rainforest that have been dedicated to, preserving its natural status. And if we're not careful, we might destroy all of these things. Mr. Prime Minister, I want to ask you a question that relates to Caribbean and Caribbean unity. We can just change hats again, away a little bit from the oil discussion. In 1990s, Patrick Manning, the then Prime Minister, had pitched an initiative for Barbados, Guyana, and Trinidad to create a kind of a political union or association. It was short-lived following the Barbados 1994 elections. I know that there was discussion in previous years between you and Cherry Jagan and also between your former Prime Minister and Burnham about creating some sort of either, well, not political, but economic union. My concern is as follows. Is there any possibility of such a union in the future? And I'm going to predicate it by saying the following. Look at CARICOM, or is it CARIGON? And CCJ, I mean, CCJ is housed in Trinidad, but not even Trinidad uses the CCJ as its final court of appeal for criminal and civil matters, unless I'm mistaken. But is there any hope that the Caribbean will one day wake up to its realization that there is strength in unity and form an economic union?
I doubt it very much because of the nature of the West Indian. Mm-hmm. The attempt at having a federation failed because everybody wanted to be king. And that's the problem in the Caribbean. Everyone wants to be king. He wants to be head of it. And because of that, there is really no genuine unity taking place in the Caribbean.
Correct.
And I doubt it will come because of the nature of the Caribbean people.
Correct.
Or Caribbean leaders, not people, Caribbean leaders.
Well, I want to follow that up with another question to you. Mr. Ramnarine, I'm not going to put you on the spot with this one. I'm going to direct it to Mr. Panday. Now,
direct all political questions to Mr. Panday.
Thank you.
And I will redirect them to Kevin.
The current status of the government of Guyana, we are heading into, according to most opinion leaders, we are heading into a constitutional crisis from September 18th. Now, as far as a lot of Guyanese are concerned, the Trinidad government has become dumb and deaf to what's happening with its neighbors. It lost its voice. CARICOM has lost its ability to see and hear and speak. And even though CARICOM enjoys the hospitality of Guyanese on a daily basis, they're housed here. What will cause the blind to see and the dumb to speak? Why this reluctance to speak at this juncture in Caribbean history? And
you broke up.
Sorry?
You broke up. I didn't get what you said.
Oh, I was speaking to CARICOM and other Caribbean nations being deaf and dumb to a constitutional crisis brewing in Guyana. And I was asking you, what will cause the blind to see and the dumb to speak?
I think the reason why they are not interfering is because they are aware that one of the basic problems that face us is the division of the two major ethnic groups. And I think they do not want to intervene in that. The same thing is happening in Trinidad, where we have a problem. And our Prime Minister will talk about Venezuela, but he's not talking about what's happening in Guyana.
Correct. No, but let me correct you. Let me correct you with one thing there. I don't know if it's a correction, but let me offer this to you. Even with Venezuela's challenging Guyana's sovereignty, there has not been as loud a hue and a cry from our own people in the Caribbean as one would expect.
Because they don't.
Yes,
because they don't care about one another. That's what I was telling you. They really don't care. Every man for himself. I got into trouble for coining a phrase that politics has its own morality. I want to coin another phrase. Nations don't have morals. They only have interests.
That is so true.
And each of those Caribbean countries are concerned only with their own interests, not with the interests of the Caribbean.
Correct. Can I put you on the spot and ask your opinion? The CCJ addressed the government of Guyana as a caretaker government. Your thoughts?
As a caretaker?
Yes, the CCJ said the Guyanese government is a caretaker government following the no confidence motion.
I don't understand what that means. How can you be a caretaker government if you've lost the vote in the parliament? So one of the reasons why Trinidad and Tobago has not become part of the Caribbean Court is because they don't have confidence in it. And I believe that what they are doing in Guyana will make them further lose confidence that people have in the court.
Mm-hmm.
I can't imagine what they mean. The government has been voted out according to the law.
Correct.
They're supposed to have an elections.
Correct.
They said so they're a caretaker government. A caretaker to take care of what? It should be only to take care of an election.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I mean, your country's politics has seen lots of ups and lots of downs. There are times that you've had stalemate yourself in your career, and you've had to make necessary sacrifices. But in Guyana, we do not see any politician that is ready to sit down and place this nation's interest first. And short of going through a public or a popular forceful change, I don't know that Guyanese interests will ever be looked after. I mean, the situation we have here, Mr. Panday, is that there are lots of Venezuelans in Guyana, there are lots of Brazilians in Guyana, there are lots of Haitians in Guyana, they're holding jobs, and Guyanese people are being unemployed and underemployed. And you speak to the authorities, they're asking you what you're talking about. You know, so the will to govern in an honest way is severely lacking. But
and you know, sorry,
go
you
on.
know why? You know why? There are many qualified Guyanese all over the world.
Correct.
They are not coming back to engage in the politics because the politics is one that is determined by ethnicity and race.
Right.
And if they come there, they have to belong to one or other of the existing parties. Otherwise, they're going to fail. I believe there are several Guyanese who did in fact come back to Guyana and attempted to get into the politics, but couldn't because of that racial, ethnic division in the society.
Well, I can tell you from personal experience, under both governments, I would have applied for jobs. On one set you didn't get because you didn't belong, and from the other set you didn't get because you don't belong. So, so you were right, guys who go and you invest your earnings and you invest your time to be better qualified. We don't necessarily get anywhere. But Mr. Panday, let me ask you this: if you were in government, if you were the Prime Minister today, and you lost a confidence vote in your Parliament, what would you do?
Well, if you lost a confidence vote, I think you'd being the government sitting, you'd use what powers you have to call an election. As a matter of fact, I went to the Parliament and I had two. We were working with a very, very slim majority. I think a majority of one or something like that. And 3 of our men went over to the PNM and voted with the PNM. And the moment that happened, I said that I was voted into office in order to serve the people. And if I cannot serve them because Parliament will not function, I dissolve the Parliament and call an election. Simple as that.
Correct. Well, in Guyana, as you may have read in the press, we have a situation where the no confidence motion was passed in December 2018, and we are approaching December 2019. And, all you were hearing the party say, well, the CCJ didn't instruct them to demit office. But, many times, and I've said this in a show before, many times politicians, they justify their actions with being legally right. And they forget that the populace is judging them on a morality.
Exactly. That's exactly why the people of Trinidad and Tobago are not subscribers to the CCJ. You're absolutely right. It is only when people have confidence in the judicial system that it works. If they don't have the confidence in the judicial system, it won't work. And the CCJ is not working, as far as I'm concerned, because they have not been able to win the confidence of the people who subscribe to the church.
But sir, in this case, the CCJ made a ruling, but it's if a government choose to not obey the orders of the consequential orders of the CCJ, then I mean the CCJ doesn't really have any force in its hands to say we're going to impose sanctions on you.
Exactly. It has no power to enforce its judgment.
Correct.
It has no power to enforce its judgment.
Correct.
And that is one of the problems of the CCJ. It can say what it wants, people ignore it.
But then you take Trinidad takes its civil and criminal matters. Your final court is the Privy Council, isn't it?
Yeah.
What
all matters, not only criminal.
Okay, correct. What can the Privy Council do to Trinidad if your government choose not to follow any orders?
What's that? Sorry.
What can the Privy Council do to Trinidad should your government not follow any of its orders?
It can't do anything. It can give judgments and hand those judgments down and expect that the authorities will implement whatever the judgment is. It can do nothing. It has no military force in order to compel obedience to its orders. Same like the CCJ.
Yeah, which is the both CCJ.
But then the people of Trinidad and Tobago have respect for the Privy Council, and they will abide by its rule. I don't think people have respect for the CCJ.
Correct. Well, in Guyana, I mean, up to this point in our history, when this no confidence motion thing, I think everybody had confidence and were supportive of matters going to the CCJ. But at this stage, when the government chooses not to obey the laws, I mean, and I'll tell you this: immediately following the no confidence motion, the Prime Minister and the President came public to say, well, they will now do what they have to do and obey the outfall of the no confidence motion. But all of a sudden, everybody's got and that's delayed us 8 months, 10 months, and we're going to a year now. Let's come back a little bit to the oil and gas sector. One of our viewers have asked a question to you, Mr. Ramnarine. Your thoughts on Guyana not having a depletion policy and its impacts on our constitutional and other capacities.
Well, I see that question came from Annette Arjun,
Correct.
who I know. I know she's a very passionate person about Guyana. So the rate at which the companies are allowed to deplete their reserves in their reservoirs in Trinidad and Tobago is determined by consultation with the Ministry of Energy.
Mm-hmm.
And the Ministry of Energy in Trinidad is resourced with a team of geologists and reservoir engineers. So we had, and I will just give one example of something which happened when I was minister. A company had discovered a natural gas reservoir and they wanted to produce it at a very high rate. And the ministry's technocrats they agreed on a lower rate. And of course, I asked both parties to sit down and to come to some agreement. And eventually there was a compromise between the ministry's reservoir engineers and the companies. The concern of the ministry staff is that if the company was to overproduce the reservoir, they would damage the reservoir and compromise the long-term viability of the industry. And of course, the company's position is that they want to produce as fast as possible, as quick as possible.
Correct.
So again, it comes back, just to answer Annette's question, it comes back to what would be the opinion of the reservoir engineers and the geologists at the Department of Energy. It comes back again to the resourcing of the institutions that have to regulate and oversee the sector. But ultimately, in Trinidad, the Ministry of Energy determines the rate at which companies produce. And normally there is consensus between the companies and the ministry.
Gotcha. But to your point too there, Mr. Ramnarine, the fact remains that at the end of the day, under the political umbrella, the type of governance Guyana has, always all of these experts are more or less, politically appointed and politically affiliated, and so many times decisions may not necessarily be in the best interest of the country, but in the best interest of the political masters.
Yeah, and this is where having an independent public service is important. So you may have a company, an oil company, which is not happy with the decision of the technocrats in the ministry. And they would go to, I'm not saying that this is happening in Guyana or will happen in Guyana or Trinidad. Hypothetically, they will go to the minister and they will get the minister on their side and they will get their way. So you have to respect the independence of the public servants. What the public service in Trinidad is not perfect, but there are a lot of highly trained independent public servants in Trinidad and Tobago who are professionals, and as ministers or prime ministers and so on, you have to listen to them.
Right, correct. So your idea of the solution to that dilemma would be to ensure that we can empower and to ensure that the persons who serve in these professional capacities always know that they owe their allegiance to the people of Guyana, and therefore they need to speak up and speak out.
They must be independent of the political directorate of the day, and act in a technical and professional manner.
Kevin, how can they be? When they are appointed by the political directorate?
That's right.
Well, that is the dilemma, right? As Mr. Panday would know, in Trinidad we have something called the Public Service Commission, which is supposed to be the insulation between the public service and the political directorate. But then the Public Service Commission is appointed by the political directorate.
That's right. And unfortunately, to Mr. Pandey's point, what's been happening in Guyana too is not only are people appointed by the government who may be in place of the day, but they're held to task for political purposes. I mean, we have situation in Guyana where companies have to contribute towards certain things, or they never get another contract. So I'll be honest with you, sometimes, as a Guyanese, we get so frustrated at the lack of political will and the sheer absence of honesty from our political sphere that you wonder if we would ever get better. But one of the things that I know can happen to our good is the influx, and this is the benefit that would come from having outside and foreign companies coming into Guyana, because it can only raise the standard, providing we have the will to.
Yeah, I want to make one point about Nigeria. The most unstable part of Nigeria, the part of Nigeria that always has civil war and sabotage of pipelines and kidnapping of expats and so on, is a place called the Niger Delta. And the Niger Delta is that part of Nigeria where most of the oil comes from. And the reason, the social and political reason for that is that those people in the Niger Delta, they see the wealth being extracted from below their feet, and they don't see themselves as benefiting from that wealth.
Goes back to what we started with Mr. Pandey's concern.
Right? So that is what you want to avoid in Guyana. You want people to feel that this wealth is benefiting me in some way.
Correct.
I agree with you absolutely, Kevin.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask another question that diverts from all that we spoke about. There's a discussion among a lot of Guyanese professionals that Guyana has to awaken to its economic reality and turn its eyes to the continent instead of to the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. And that's when there's a great belief that that's when we'll really, really start to live up to our potential. But in that case, what would there then be an outfall for Caribbean and concerns and Caribbean unity? I memean, at least we have CARICOM even in its name. What do you think about that paradigm? Mr. Panday? Well, I think we have lost him a bit. Mr. Ramnarine?
I think we lost Mr. Panday there. I think that, Guyana has to do what's in the best interest of Guyana.
Correct.
And that is your first port of call.
Correct.
And you have to, the reality is that Guyana is fundamentally different from the rest of the Caribbean. You are part of a continental landmass, South America.
Correct.
And you sit on the border of one of the world's largest economies, Brazil. And if I were to think strategically, I would think that Guyana has to forge a strategic partnership, long-term strategic partnership with Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that you don't continue to build your ties with CARICOM.
Correct.
Right? But there's a lot of economic potential that could be unlocked between northern Brazil and Guyana.
Absolutely.
So I think that that makes Guyana unique in that you have a physical land border with one of the world's largest economies in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Correct. So, gentlemen, we're getting near to the end of our program time, and it's been wonderful chatting with you. I'm going to defer to you, Mr. Ramnarine, first for your final thoughts, and especially with regards to, if you could give a wrap on our need for those three things you mentioned: the institutional capacity, infrastructure, and civil empowerment. Final thought, Mr. Ramnarine.
Final thought would be that the future belongs to Guyana, and the choices that you make will determine whether that's going to be a great future or whether you're going to go the way of Nigeria, as we saw the video. And the choices are really there to be made. I would say focus on developing the people of the country.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, the young people, focus on educating them and giving them the skill sets to be part of the 21st century, to be the leaders of this oil and gas industry. And I think that is my parting thought, focus on developing the youth.
Thank you. Mr. Panday, I would want to, I'm going to give you your time for your last final thoughts on this program. But before we go, so I can assure you that your concerns in terms of the requirement for constitutional change is now not just a whisper in Guyana, it's becoming quite a loud call across many sectors. And we are extremely concerned at the rampage, the runaway corruption that continues to take place in this country. Final thoughts from you, sir.
Well, I'm a peaceful person. I don't like violence. But I believe the Caribbean, Trinidad and Guyana, are on the verge of political violence because of our failure to deal with the discrimination that takes place between the two ethnic and racial groups.
Correct.
So therefore, I in Trinidad, and hope someone in Ghana will keep struggling for peaceful change of the Constitution.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. And I would want to thank both of you for being on the program. It's been most educational. It's been a privilege and honor to have you on board, Mr. Panday, as the former Prime Minister of Trinidad. Your thoughts, suggestions, and opinions are always welcome by us. And Mr. Ramnarine, your incisive discussion on the oil and gas sector is extremely welcome. And we would want to ensure that we continue to capitalize on both of your skills and your experience and your education and everything. I would want to close by reminding our viewers that, the discussions we have had here and the concerns about corruption and political will or lack thereof is from the perspective of not just oil money. It's from the perspective of our children, our grandchildren. They're the ones that will reap either the benefits of our success or the hardships from our failures. At the current pace, we may be ashamed to look at their faces. One of your viewers, again, I think it was Miss Annette Arjun, did mention that maybe one potential solution can be for the political parties to earn our vote by having a binding mechanism for accountability of our resources in their manifestos. The problem we have had historically, and not just Guyana, all countries, is politicians say whatever they want in the manifestos to win the vote. And there is no legal mechanism to hold you to your election promise.
That's right.
So, it's something that Guyanese people, I think as a people, we have to really get together and work towards one goal, Guyana. Not a political party, Guyana. Mr. Ramnarine, former Minister of Energy and Energy Matters, thank you so very much for being on board.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mahadeo.
And I hope we can pick up this conversation on another show again. Mr. Panday, former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, elder statesman, sir, it's been a distinct pleasure and honor to have you on board. And I certainly hope we can pick the conversation up again another day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Here. Thank you both. And thank you to Devin, who has been our technical person on board, to the GlobeSpan team for being there with us, and of course to Nohar Singh. This has been his dream too, to see these two gentlemen on this show. So thank you all, and to our viewers, have a wonderful night. Good night.
Thank you.